It started as a joke. A cruel one, masked with a polished smile and wrapped in the velvet curtains of prestige. The Walt Disney Concert Hall in downtown Los Angeles buzzed with laughter and champagne, as LA's elite gathered for what was supposed to be just another glamorous charity gala. Among the pearls and tuxedos, one presence stood out, not because she tried to, but because she didn't belong. Naomi Brooks, 16, stood quietly near the edge of the stage, her braided hair tied neatly, her hand gripping a white cane. She was blind, and black, and not from any prep school or elite conservatory. She had come with her public high school music teacher, who managed to secure 2 last-minute invites. Just being in that room felt like breaking some unspoken rule. Then, the voice came. Smooth and sharp as a piano string, Victor Langston, 45, America's most celebrated concert pianist, dressed in custom Dior, holding a flute of Dom Perignon. He turned to the crowd and said with a smirk, "How about a little fun? Hey, sweetheart, do you know how to play Happy Birthday?" Laughter followed, polite but pointed. Naomi didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. "Actually," she said calmly, "I prefer Beethoven." The room fell silent. You could hear the air conditioning hum. Victor chuckled again, this time less certain. "Really?" he asked. "And what would you play, darling?" Naomi's voice cut through the silence with the weight of something bigger than defiance. "Sonata number 32 in C minor." She paused. "But I imagine it might be too complex for this audience." The insult was wrapped in elegance. And that's when the energy shifted. It was no longer a spectacle. It was about to become a reckoning. What no one knew was that Naomi didn't just know the sonata. She had lived it. And in the next few minutes, every eye in that room would be forced to confront a truth they had tried to laugh away. And that truth had a soundtrack. Naomi Brooks was not the kind of girl anyone expected to see on a stage like this. She didn't come from a family of musicians, didn't attend elite music camps, and had never once stepped foot inside a private academy. She lived with her grandmother, Miss Claudette, in a one-bedroom apartment on the south side of Los Angeles, just a few blocks from where the freeway split the neighborhood in two. Their building was old. The walls were thin, and the elevator hadn't worked in years. But in that small apartment sat an even older upright piano, scratched, slightly out of tune, and donated by a local church when Naomi was 9. That piano, crammed between a bookshelf and a tiny dining table, was where Naomi spent nearly every waking moment. She was born with sight but lost it at the age of 7 in a car accident that claimed both her parents. The world went dark in a flash of metal and shattered glass. But where her vision ended, something else began. Naomi found music, not as a hobby, but as a language her heart could still speak. She didn't just learn to play. She devoured music. Her fingers translated pain into harmony, silence into movement. Her school's music teacher, Mr. Haywood, recognized her talent early on. He once found her in the music room after school, replaying an entire Rachmaninoff piece she had heard only once that morning. No sheet music, just memory and touch. By the time she was 15, Naomi had memorized over 300 compositions. Chopin, Brahms, Debussy, and Beethoven. Each one stored in the architecture of her mind like blueprints she could walk through at will. She had no YouTube tutorials, no expensive coaching, just old CDs, hand-me-down Braille scores, and a relentless drive to understand what others could only hear. But outside her neighborhood, no one knew her name. No articles, no scholarships. Just another quiet girl walking with a cane and a head full of music. Until tonight. Until this room. Until Victor Langston handed her the microphone, not out of kindness, but mockery. And that was his first mistake. Because Naomi Brooks wasn't just here to play music. She was here to be heard. Victor Langston knew how to work a room. He didn't need to raise his voice or flash a fake smile. The mere tilt of his glass or the slight lift of an eyebrow could shift the energy in an instant. That night, he'd already performed a flawless rendition of a Chopin nocturne, earning standing applause from the city's most critical patrons. He was riding the high of admiration when his eyes landed on Naomi. She wasn't part of the plan. Just a girl in a simple black dress, standing still, holding a white cane like it was the only solid thing in her world. He turned toward her, microphone in hand, voice dripping with polished arrogance. "Let's lighten the mood, shall we, Miss Brooks, was it? The audience chuckled politely. Come on up here. I'm sure you can dazzle us with a little Mary had a little lamb. Maybe Twinkle, Twinkle. Some guests laughed louder than they should have. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. After all, this was Victor Langston, prodigy, Grammy winner, and the night star attraction. Naomi didn't move. Not at first. Her fingers curled gently around her cane. Then, slowly, she stepped forward, her shoes clicking softly against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed just enough to hush the laughter. When she reached the Steinway, she placed her hand on the bench, not to sit, but to anchor herself. I appreciate the invitation, Naomi said softly, but I was hoping for something more substantial. Victor raised a brow. Oh, and what would that be? Naomi turned her face toward the audience. I'd like to play Beethoven's Sonata No. 32 in C minor. Gasps spread like a ripple through the crowd. Victor smirked, but the edges of his expression cracked ever so slightly. Ambitious, he replied, but perhaps a bit too advanced for tonight's audience? Naomi didn't blink. Perhaps, she said. Or perhaps they've simply never heard it played by someone who understands what it really means. That landed like a thunderclap. Victor's smile faltered. In that moment, the room felt split between two realities. One still wrapped in assumption, the other teetering on revelation. He had tried to reduce her to a punchline. But Naomi Brooks had just rewritten the setup. And the punchline? It was coming for him. Victor Langston had spent decades commanding stages, outshining peers with nothing more than a piano and the confidence of someone who believed the rules were written for everyone else. But for the first time in a long time, his smile didn't reach his eyes. He leaned closer to the microphone. Beethoven's Sonata No. 32 in C minor, he repeated, almost mockingly. That's quite the choice, Miss Brooks. His voice carried the tone of a teacher indulging a student who didn't know better. You do realize, of course, that it was the last piano sonata Beethoven ever wrote? It's not just complex, it's transcendent. Most conservatory students won't even attempt it before their master's recital. Naomi didn't flinch. Yes, she said plainly. I know. Victor chuckled, his voice tightening. It demands not just technical excellence, but emotional maturity. Are you sure you're ready to deliver that? Naomi tilted her head slightly, as if listening for something distant. Then she answered, her voice steady and clear. Beethoven composed it in the final years of his life. Completely deaf. He didn't need sound to write it. He needed memory, grief, suffering. She paused. I don't play music to impress anyone, she added. I play because I understand what silence feels like, what losing everything sounds like. That stopped the room. No witty retorts. No polite laughter. Victor's grip on the microphone tightened. Very well, he said, masking his unease. But let's not rob our generous guests of a fair comparison. He turned to the piano and, with a theatrical flair, began to play the opening bars of the sonata. Slow, precise, emotionless. Each note was technically correct, polished, academic. He played like someone solving an equation, not telling a story. Naomi stood beside him, her expression unreadable behind her sunglasses. But inside, she was absorbing every measure, every subtle misstep in emotion, every phrase played without understanding. Victor closed the piece with a flourish and stood. Your turn, he said, gesturing dramatically to the bench. Naomi stepped forward, placed her cane gently beside the stool, and ran her fingers lightly over the keys, not to test them, but to say hello. The room held its breath. And in that pause, everyone felt it. This wasn't about music anymore. This was about truth. As Naomi settled onto the piano bench, a shift rippled through the room, quiet but unmistakable. The kind of stillness that happens right before a storm changes everything. Up until that moment, most of the audience had treated her like a novelty. A sweet gesture, a publicity moment, maybe even a nice little story to tell over dinner later. A blind girl playing classical music? Touching. Inspirational. Safe. But something had changed. It started with the way she placed her hands on the keys. Slowly, gently, like they were sacred. Not fumbling, not guessing. Like she'd known them her whole life. Her fingers hovered with intent, not hesitation. In the second row, Carol Donovan, a former opera singer who had seen more than her share of performative performances, sat up straighter. She didn't know what was coming, but her gut told her it wouldn't be background music. 3 seats down, Leonard Hayes, a retired music critic who'd written scathing reviews of dozens of overhyped prodigies, squinted behind his glasses. He had mocked the idea of letting some public school girl share a stage with Victor Langston. But now, even he leaned forward, and in the back of the room, by the double doors, Naomi's grandmother stood still, hands clasped tightly in front of her, not from nerves, but from knowing. She had heard this before, not in a concert hall, but in a living room with peeling wallpaper and a broken radiator. She knew what Naomi could do. The rest of the world was about to find out. Then Naomi spoke, not to boast, not to provoke, but to center everyone's attention. "I'm not here to play a piece," she said softly. "I'm here to tell a story. And like every real story, it starts with pain." No one moved. No one blinked. Because for the first time all night, the crowd wasn't watching a blind girl who might surprise them. They were watching a girl who just might change them. Victor Langston was no amateur. That much everyone knew. He'd spent decades mastering the keyboard with surgical precision. Every recital, every competition, every standing ovation had been earned with discipline, not emotion. And tonight, he was going to remind the room why his name was etched into plaques at Juilliard and printed on the programs of every major concert hall in America. After Naomi's unexpected challenge, Victor returned to the Steinway with a performer's swagger. He didn't acknowledge her again, didn't glance her way. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks, straightened his back, and placed his fingers over the keys like a man preparing to conduct electricity. Then he played. The notes came sharp, clean, and deliberate. Every run, every trill, every arpeggio was executed with flawless technique. There was no hesitation, no mistakes, no room for doubt. He moved through the opening of Beethoven's Sonata No. 32 with the confidence of someone who had played it 1,000 times, and probably had. People in the audience nodded in approval. Some clapped softly mid-performance, a breach of etiquette excused only by admiration. His fingers flew, never slipping. It was, by every measurable standard, impeccable. But something was missing. For those truly listening, truly feeling, the performance left a void. It was too perfect, too clean, like staring at a painting behind glass. Beautiful, but unreachable. In the third row, Leonard Hayes leaned toward Carol Donovan and whispered, "He's playing the sheet music. She's going to play the emotion." Carol didn't answer. She just watched, her eyes fixed not on Victor, but on Naomi, who sat patiently to the side, her head bowed like she was praying, not for her own performance, but for the music itself. Victor finished with a signature flourish, lifting his hands slowly as if sealing the piece like a signed masterpiece. The room erupted in polite applause. It was the kind of clapping reserved for excellence without surprise. Victor turned and gave a slight bow, soaking in the moment. But even he could feel it. The applause was respectful, but it wasn't moved. And the silence that followed? That was for her. Because Naomi Brooks hadn't even played yet. As the final notes of Victor's performance faded into the rafters, Naomi stood up from her seat. She didn't rush to the piano. She didn't make a show of stretching her fingers or clearing her throat. Instead, she turned, facing the audience without facing them, her eyes behind dark glasses, her posture upright, her voice calm. "Beethoven didn't write this sonata to impress anyone," she began. "He wasn't performing for kings or critics. He wrote it when he was alone, deaf, and dying." The crowd quieted again, though it hadn't exactly gotten loud. Naomi's words seemed to rearrange the energy in the room. "This sonata," she continued, "isn't about technical brilliance. It's about surrender. About wrestling with the silence that follows a life full of music. It's about knowing you can't hear the world anymore, but still needing to speak." She took a breath. The first movement, Allegro, it's full of questions. Like a man pacing back and forth in his own mind, trying to reason with the pain, trying to remember what sound felt like. She stepped toward the piano, gently resting her hand on the lid. The second movement, Arietta, it's not just melody. It's forgiveness. It's Beethoven letting go. And when those variations build, they don't rise to a climax for applause. They rise because the soul is searching for peace. Several people in the audience had stopped breathing altogether. Not from fear, but reverence. It wasn't just what Naomi was saying. It was how she said it. She wasn't explaining music. She was translating grief. Victor, standing off to the side now, kept a tight jaw. His fingers, just moments ago the center of attention, now felt stiff at his sides. Naomi ran her fingers lightly over the keys. "When I play this," she said, her voice soft but clear, "I'm not playing what Beethoven wrote on paper." She paused, then added, "I'm playing what he couldn't say out loud." And with that, she sat down. Naomi sat with perfect posture, her hands resting gently on the keys, not poised for performance, but for communion. For a few seconds, the room held a breath it didn't know it had taken. Her fingers didn't move. Not yet. Then she began. It wasn't loud or theatrical. There was no dramatic show of confidence. Her first note was barely more than a whisper, but it was alive. It breathed into the hall like a sigh from a soul that had waited years to be heard. And just like that, the air changed. Gone was the stiff formality. Gone was the forced politeness. The sonata spilled out of her like a prayer she'd memorized not with her mind, but with her scars. Each phrase in the opening allegro came not with perfect timing, but with human weight. Like Beethoven himself was in the room, nodding slowly from the shadows, recognizing the truth in the way she bent certain notes, lingered on others. It wasn't textbook. It was lived in. As Naomi played, her shoulders barely moved. But inside that stillness was a storm of emotion, restrained only by the grace of her control. She reached the arietta, the second movement, and time slowed. The melody unfolded like a conversation with someone long gone. Soft, broken, beautiful. Her left hand grounded the rhythm like a steady heartbeat, while her right danced above it, as if carrying memories on each fingertip. There was a moment, just one, when a single note hung in the air for what felt like forever. She held it longer than expected. Too long, by traditional standards. But no one in the room cared, because in that pause, everyone felt it. That ache of remembering something you wish you could forget. The weight of love, lost but still breathing in the corners of your life. Naomi didn't just play Beethoven. She played every hospital visit, every unanswered question. Every night she cried into her pillow without knowing if the pain would ever soften. And somehow she made it beautiful. In the fourth row, a woman reached for her husband's hand. In the back, someone who hadn't cried in years wiped their cheek without knowing why. Victor Langston, standing rigid beside the piano, stared at her like a man realizing he'd opened a door he couldn't close. When Naomi reached the final bars, she didn't end with flair. She didn't slam the last chord or toss her hands in triumph. She let the final note fade like a sunset. Soft, glowing, full of finality. Then a silence. Not the awkward kind. Not the waiting for applause kind. The sacred kind. The kind of silence that only comes after truth. Naomi sat still for a beat longer, her hands still resting on the keys like she was afraid letting go might break the spell. Then finally, she turned her head slightly toward the audience and whispered, not into the mic, not for attention, but for herself, "This is what it means to be heard." For several long seconds after Naomi's final note dissolved into the air, no one moved. It wasn't the kind of pause you leave after a performance. It was the kind of silence that follows revelation. A moment when something inside the room, and inside the people in it, has shifted, but no one knows how to speak about it yet. Then, slowly, it began. First, one person stood, an older woman near the front. She clutched a tissue to her chest and looked at Naomi like she had just been reintroduced to humanity. Then another stood, and another, until the entire concert hall rose, row by row, in quiet unison. No one clapped at first. They just stood, and felt. Victor Langston remained by the side of the piano, hands clasped, expression frozen. His world, the one he'd built with medals, critic reviews, and velvet rope access, had tilted beneath him. The applause came next. It wasn't wild or frantic. It was slow, deep, full of reverence. Like people weren't clapping for a performance, but thanking someone for showing them something they didn't know they were missing. Behind Naomi, Victor finally lowered his head. Not in shame, not yet, but in realization. He had performed. Naomi had testified. What he had offered was expertise. What she had given was experience. At the back of the room, Naomi's grandmother wiped tears from her eyes, but her posture remained strong. She wasn't surprised. She'd seen this in Naomi since the beginning. The world was just catching up. And as the applause continued, louder now like a wave building, somewhere deep in Victor's chest, a truth he didn't want to admit began to settle in. Tonight wasn't about him anymore. And maybe it never was. Naomi didn't linger on stage after the applause ended. She stood quietly, gave a respectful nod toward the audience, though she couldn't see their faces, and returned to her seat beside her grandmother, her hand brushing against the old woman's arm like a silent, "We did it." By the time the final program closed that night, the room had changed. So had Naomi's life. The next morning, clips of her performance, recorded on shaky iPhones by guests who couldn't bear to let the moment slip away, began spreading across social media. By noon, one had hit 1 million views. By evening, it was the headline on every major music blog. Blind teen delivers soul-stirring Beethoven, redefines classical performance at LA Gala. Her name, once unknown beyond her block, was now being spoken in boardrooms and broadcast studios. The Curtis Institute of Music, one of the most selective music schools in the country, called within 48 hours. Naomi was offered a full scholarship. No audition needed. They had heard all they needed to. TV producers reached out for interviews. Celebrities posted the video with captions like, "Goosebumps," and "This young woman is the future of music." But for Naomi, none of that mattered as much as what came 1 week later. Her high school held an assembly. It wasn't fancy. Just a mic in the cafeteria and a borrowed speaker system. But every student showed up. Even the ones who usually skipped assemblies. When Naomi stepped to the mic and someone yelled, "You're a legend," she smiled. Not the kind of smile you wear when you're praised, but the kind that says, "Finally, I'm seen." She didn't talk about fame or the video. She talked about showing up, every day. Practicing when no one's watching. Believing in your own voice even when no one else does. That night, back in her tiny apartment, Naomi sat at her old upright piano and placed her fingers on the chipped keys. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. It was 6 months after the gala when Naomi received the email. The subject line was simple. An invitation to collaborate. The sender, Victor Langston. At first, she thought it might be a mistake, or maybe someone playing a cruel joke. But it was real. Formal. Polite. He was organizing a concert series called Bridging Generations, aimed at pairing young talents with established names in classical music. Naomi's name, he wrote, was at the top of his list. The irony wasn't lost on her. She read the email twice, then closed her laptop and sat in silence. It wasn't anger she felt. It was something softer. Something closer to clarity. The next day, Naomi agreed to meet him, not in a studio or a boardroom, but in a small rehearsal hall in Westwood. Neutral ground. No stage. No press. When Victor walked in, he looked older than she remembered. Not in years, but in weight, like the kind of weight that doesn't show up on a scale. His usual crisp confidence was still there, but it came with something else now. Something that looked a little like humility. "Naomi," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." She shook it. Firm. Respectful. But without warmth. Victor gestured toward the piano. "I meant what I wrote," he said. "I'd be honored to share the stage with you." "We could." Naomi raised a hand gently to stop him. "You know," she said, "I used to think success was when someone like you finally saw someone like me." Victor's jaw tensed, but he didn't interrupt. "But I've learned," she continued, "that being seen isn't the same as being respected. I don't need your stage, Mr. Langston. I'm building my own." There was no anger in her voice. No malice. Just truth. She stood, gathered her cane, and turned toward the door. "I appreciate the offer," she said, "but I'm not here to follow someone else's path." And with that, she walked out, leaving Victor Langston alone in a quiet room, staring at a piano that had never felt so silent. A year after that unforgettable night at the Walt Disney Concert Hall, Naomi Brooks stood on the stage of Carnegie Hall, not as a guest, not as a student, but as the featured performer. She wore a simple black gown. Her hair was braided neatly. No flashing lights, no dramatic introductions. Just her, a piano, and a hall packed with people from all over the country. Critics, musicians, families, teachers, even former skeptics, now seated as witnesses. Before her fingers touched the keys, Naomi walked to the mic. "I've been asked many times what changed my life," she began. "And people expect me to say that moment on stage. The standing ovation, the viral video." She paused. "But the truth is, what changed my life was learning that my voice didn't need permission." The room was still. You could hear the hum of the lights, the distant creak of someone shifting in a seat. Naomi continued, "For a long time, I thought talent was something you earned after someone important said you had it. I thought you had to wait to be invited, to be accepted." She shook her head gently. "But now I know better." She stepped back to the piano and let her hand float just above the keys. Music doesn't belong to the privileged. It doesn't belong to those with titles or tuxedos. Music belongs to those who have something to say and the courage to say it. Naomi's voice remained soft, but every word carried weight. "My music is not about proving I belong," she said. "It's about reminding others that no one can decide who does." There was a hush, not of boredom, but of reverence. Naomi sat at the bench and played, not Beethoven this time, but a piece of her own. A composition written in the quiet hours of the night, between scholarship interviews and lesson plans. A piece titled Unseen Light. Each note was a message. To the kid practicing alone in a basement with broken keys. To the girl told to stay quiet until she was older, smarter, whiter, or richer. To anyone who has ever been talked over, stepped on, or overlooked. The message was simple. You matter. When she finished, the audience didn't clap immediately. They rose. Slowly. As if standing was the only response that made sense. And as the lights faded, Naomi Brooks reminded the world that some voices don't need sight. They just need to be heard.